tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammaṃ Sanghaṃ Namasami. Good evening, everybody. I was invited to give some reflections or recollections of Luang Sumedho tonight, because in a couple of days' time it will be his 86th birthday, and he's currently staying in Thailand, but he's visited this monastery a few times, and I've known him for almost 40 years, and he's had as a monk, he's had a huge influence on the particularly the Western or foreign sangha of Ajahn Chah, and many Buddhists all over the world are familiar with him and his teachings. When I was beginning my monastic practice, I travelled to Thailand from the UK. I was recommended to go and see Ajahn Chah, find him, and I spent one rains retreat in the early 1980s at Wat Pah Nanachat, keeping the 8 precepts, wearing white with a shaved head. And then I had to go back to the UK to finish up my business, as it were, so that I could return to Thailand to begin training, my full-time training as a Buddhist monk. So while I was in Thailand, I didn't yet know Luang Sumedho, but because I heard about him in Thailand, when I went back to the UK, I made the time to visit Chithurst Buddhist Monastery on a number of occasions during that period, and got to know him there. So that was my first recollection of Luang Sumedho. In those days he was known as Ajahn Sumedho. The word Lumpur is from the Thai language, and it's both a respectful and affectionate way of referring to an elder monk. It means venerable father. So Luang Chah used to be called Lumpur. Luang Sumedho is called Lumpur. And he was leading the community at Chithurst Monastery, the first proper monastery of our tradition in the UK. There was quite a large number of monks, nuns and lay people staying there, practicing there, but in quite difficult conditions. There were very few facilities. The support was quite new, so there wasn't always that much in the way of support, material support. And a number of people I remember in that year when I visited quite a few times said, the only reason I can stay here is because Luang Sumedho gives us a talk almost every night. They're what keep me going. So that's something that many people have said over the years. They found his presence, his reflections on the Dhamma, his example, something very inspiring, and it's kept them going in their own practice. So, on the occasion of his birthday, that's something that many people are thinking of with gratitude and appreciation, the value of a wise teacher who's a good example. I went back to Thailand and began my training there at Wat Pah Nanachat and Wat Nong Ba Pong. But because Luang Chah had begun his long-term illness, the last 10 years of his life, he had a serious illness. Luang Sumedho would visit almost every year, and he was invited to give a retreat for the sangha, at the Western sangha, when he came over. He would give talks elsewhere, but he would give a retreat And that was a time we got to hear a lot of his own personal experience in the practice during the time he was living in Thailand before, and then during the time he was living with Ajahn Chah. So that's where I got a lot of my recollections of Luang Por Sumedho. So you may be aware of many of these things from his own sort of teachings and literature, but I'll just mention a few things tonight. He was born, I think, in Seattle, USA, and came over in the 1960s to Malaysia, to Sabah, the island, where he was teaching English and practicing in the American Peace Corps. But he was also interested in Buddhism, had been for a number of years, and that took him to Thailand, where he also was teaching English at Dhamma University, but with an interest in Buddhism, and that took him to ordain as a novice monk in Nong Khai at a monastery that taught what you might call Vipassana. But he was the only Westerner there. This is in the mid-1960s. It's around the same time that a contemporary of his, Luang Por Panyawada, the English monk, who was the senior foreign disciple of Luang Ta Mahabua. He was living in Udon Thani at the time. But they didn't know each other then. They knew each other later. But Luang Por Sumedho went to stay in Nong Khai, ordained as a novice monk, and was practicing meditation, living in a kuti, in a small temple, but without any real training in the monastic discipline or in the techniques of meditation. He was pretty much left to his own devices, he said. And also there was the language barrier, but he was learning some Thai. And he found that he had a lot of time to meditate on his own, but because he had little guidance, he ran into some problems. So one was just not knowing the monastic form and the rules and the do's and the don'ts, and he realized that lack of teaching and guidance was a limitation in his practice. He didn't fully understand the value of the training and how it could help him. And also in meditation, he was learning to meditate, and he experienced quite a lot of states of calm, but similarly his development of wisdom and insight was also limited without a teacher. And he said much of that first year as a novice monk, he experienced a lot of aversion, which is something that he would bring up these stories. When I was a young monk in Thailand, we would hear these stories which would help us to understand, because most people have the same experience. Monks and nuns, first few years in monastic life can be quite tricky because you're learning to deal with your own mind for the first time in quite a direct way. You're learning to live the life of a renunciant, celibate, in simplicity, poverty, and particularly living in Thailand, a different country. If you're from abroad, you don't know the language, the culture, the food is different, the climate is different, and so on. So the experiences he had were very similar to many other people, so his talks and reflections have been very useful for sangha members over the years to hear. So he talked about how he had all this anger coming up. It's basically, I'd say, the conditioning from previous lay life. You come into the monastic form, suddenly you don't have all the freedoms that you had before. You don't have money, and you're not going here and there. And our minds are pretty stubborn, set in their ways, and we have our own views and opinions, and that causes a lot of suffering. So he was experiencing that. But he said at one point during this 1 year period, there was a time where he'd been just experiencing anger over and over again, coming up in his mind for no real reason. He couldn't blame someone else for it. But then he had this realization that he was just creating suffering for himself. and he should really put all this angry thoughts, negative thoughts down. And he said he had this really clear realization on one day, and he can remember that day it all seemed to dissolve, and he experienced blissful piti and sukha, rapture, light, brightness of mind, peace of mind. And he said really he thought he was possibly enlightened, which again is a very common experience for new monastics who are keen for results and to go far in their practice. And so for a while he thought maybe he was enlightened, because all his anger had dropped away. But then he had to, if I remember right, he had to get a visa extension, renewal or something, and he had to go to the consulate, and he had to meet with the American consul in Nong Khai, I think, and didn't get much help there. It was a very frustrating process, and he fell back into a lot of anger, and he said he realized he wasn't yet enlightened because the anger returned. Anyone who's had to do visas, especially at this time with coronavirus, will know some of the frustrations of travel and bureaucracy. So that brought him back down to earth and gave him this sense of that he really needed a teacher, somebody to guide him further in the practice. And he was fortunate that he met a forest monk, Prat Somai, who was a disciple of Ajahn Chah, who was passing through the region, and this monk spoke some English as well and kindly encouraged Ajahn Sumedho, or the Samanera, novice Sumedho, to go and find Ajahn Chah. I think before he found Ajahn Chah, he received his monk's ordination, so he went to see Ajahn Chah as a monk. But Prat Somai was like his first mentor and took him to see Ajahn Chah because of Prat Somai's faith in Ajahn Chah, his own teacher. Ajahn Sumedho himself didn't know Ajahn Chah. Ajahn Chah wasn't yet famous, because this is like maybe 1967, I think. But out of having listened to Prat Somai, Luang Por Sumedho went to Ubon to see Luang Por Chah. It's interesting, the year before, during a period of time, Ajahn Chah was overseeing the building of some kutis, meditation huts in his monastery. He didn't yet have any foreign monks living with him. But when they were building one kuti, he told the villagers, who were the carpenters, to make the door extra high. And anyone who's lived in Thai monasteries will be aware, if you've come from the West and you're a little bit taller than Thai nationals, you'll be aware many of the meditation huts have very low ceilings and low doorways, and taller monks often bang their head on the top of the doorway if they're not mindful. So the villagers were very surprised because they're all much shorter than a Westerner, and they all said, "Why do you want such a big door? You know, no one's that big." And Ajahn Chah said something to the effect of, "Well, the tall foreigners are going to come and live with us, so we better make the doorway big." Which is interesting because at that time they hadn't arrived, and there was no obvious reason why foreigners would come to live with Ajahn Chah. So perhaps he knew something in advance. So anyway, a year later, Prat Somai brought Luang Por Sumedho to Ajahn Chah, and he offered himself to Ajahn Chah as a disciple, a student, but he said he didn't really know him yet, only his reputation from others. So he thought he'd just try it out and see. And Ajahn Chah received him, and one of the first things he said to him is, "Well, you can live here, but we're not going to spoil you. We're not going to give you special food, special privileges. You're just going to have to take it as you find it, just as any other monk does." Which in those days, when forest monasteries were very simple, the food was simple, the material support was very limited. That was quite quite a thing to go and live in that situation and without any privileges and without getting spoilt. So that was quite a good, he said, Lumpur Sumedho said, that was quite good for him because, we're used to in the lay life following our desires and our moods and getting what we want, and when we're frustrated, if we can't get what we want, we get angry, we protest, we go out and make sure we get what we want. And you come into a very poor but very well-trained sangha and poor monastery with a very good teacher, you're not going to get that. So he said it was very good for him to hear those words, even though it wasn't easy. So he came to live with Lumpur Chah, and Lumpur Chah, gave him lots of encouragement, but it was very physically quite hard in those days. So he learned a lot through just being patient and enduring through the difficulties. And he said in those days, his again the anger that he had experienced before revived, came up. Learning the monastic discipline, being trained, living with other monks who were all Thai, language problems, and just getting by with the routine of the monastery brought up a lot of aversion. And so there were occasions, he's noted many times, he'd be sweeping the leaves, which is a standard thing you do in a forest monastery in the afternoon. You sweep leaves to clean all the grounds of leaves and twigs that have fallen off the trees. And you have to make your own broom, and Western monks were often not very good at making brooms because we're not brought up with that kind of skill. So he had a really bad broom that was a cast-off from another monk, and he was sweeping with this bad broom, and it's hot and dusty and you get sweaty, which just brought out even more aversion to the whole process. He said in his mind he wanted to be off meditating. Why should he have to be sweeping with a bad broom? And one day he was sweeping, Ajahn Chah walked up to him and just said, "Is Wat Bapong suffering?" Smiling, and then went away with no further explanation. And Ajahn Sumedho said it really struck him because all this time he'd been experiencing a lot of anger, ill will in his mind, and the way you do when you get angry, you blame this person and that thing and this issue and that problem. But that simple question brought him back to the present moment and made him realize, the anger is really my own suffering, my own wrong thinking, my own attachment in my own mind. It's not the monastery. So he said for him that was a turning point, getting that real clarity that the problem is not outside with the monastery or other people, it's inside, my own thinking, my own attachment. And there were many occasions that he said he had that kind of insight when he had his own opinions about the way things should be, coming from the West, from America, and things were done very differently, so he'd often have these opinions coming up which would cause him internal suffering, but really he couldn't blame anyone else around him. So it forced him to look at his own mind and try to resolve it internally. So there were other things, so with a teacher like Ajahn Chah, the monks all had a lot of faith in him. There's maybe 60 or 70 monks and novices living with him. So every morning you go out on alms round in the villages, Ajahn Chah would walk back in with some of the monks, and it's the tradition we wash the feet of the teacher. There's a foot bath and you wash the feet, you crouch down, wash the feet of the teacher, and then you dry the feet of the teacher with a towel. And this is a sign of respect from the student to their teacher. And because the Thai monks have such great faith, there's often a big crowd of monks crowding around Ajahn Chah to do this job. They all feel it's like very good karma to clean the feet of the teacher. It's a sort of, you're cleaning the feet of the teacher, you're cleaning your mind at the same time. Ajahn Sumedho used to sit there watching this and think, I'm not going to do that. He's already got a dozen monks cleaning his feet, he doesn't need one more. So he'd look at that situation and just sit where he was, but probably a little bit critical or opinionated. And then one day it just dawned on him that, he's sitting there watching this scene, all the monks with faith, with very wholesome states of mind, cleaning Luang Por Chah's feet. He's sitting there kind of grumbling, looking down on this whole thing, and then he realized that the suffering is really my suffering, my problem. So that day he got up and he said there was one more monk helping to clean Ajahn Chah's feet. And when he was cleaning Ajahn Chah's feet, Ajahn Chah looked down at him and said, Sumedho yom lao. Yom lao means, now you've given up to the practice. You've given up to the Dhamma Vinaya rather than always following your own views and opinions. And that was one of the flavors of Luang Por Chah's teaching. Whoever you were, he was always getting you to see your own mind and see whether you've really given up to the Dhamma yet, or you're still just following your moods, your opinions, your own thoughts on things. So this kind of situation went on for a few years, his early years. Ajahn Sumedho, learning as the only Western monk, living with Ajahn Chah, learning how to bring the Dhamma into his heart. Another occasion was on the Buddhist observance days, the full moon, the new moon, the half moon days. Once a week there would be an all-night meditation program in the monastery, which was compulsory for all the monks. Began at 7 p.m. with chanting, Dhamma teaching, and then meditation right through till 4 a.m. there'd be more chanting, and then finish about 5. So a whole night program that you weren't allowed to miss. You couldn't go back to your hut for a sleep. You had to stay and sit or walk meditation, participate in that program. So it's quite demanding, draining physically. And then, of course, at 5 a.m. it's not the end of it. You go out on alms round to get your daily food, come back, eat your meal. So it might not be till 10 or 11 a.m. that you actually get to rest. So both physically and mentally quite demanding, and that happens once a week. So again, there was in one of the early periods that he was there, Ajahn Sumedho said he had aversion to this program where you sit for many hours battling with sleepiness, pain in your legs. Just seemed like a miserable kind of practice that not really that useful. So one day he went to Ajahn Chah and asked him, he said, look, I don't think that this is a very useful practice. I'm not getting any real Dhamma from this. I'm just battling with sleepiness, just enduring pain in my knees. Because in those days there's no zafus or cushions. You're just sitting on a very thin little cloth mat on hard concrete. And the hall, at that time, the meditation hall, there's no electricity, so there's no fans. The windows were very small. The foreign monks used to call it a Mexican jail because there were bars on the windows. So it was hot, stuffy, unpleasant, full of mosquitoes, but quite challenging to meditate there for an hour, let alone a whole night. So Ajahn Sumedho explained this to Ajahn Chah and said, I don't think this is a valuable practice. And Ajahn Chah said, okay, I've heard your comments. And the next time there was a meeting of all the monks, so 70 monks and novices, Ajahn Chah said, okay, so tonight we've got our all-night meditation program, but we're giving Sumedho special permission not to attend. He'll just go back to his hut and sleep. And of course, the young Ajahn Sumedho was embarrassed by that. It's like the Western logic coming up against Dhamma Vinaya, and the Western logic crumbled and he just felt very embarrassed. So that was the end of that. From then on he attended the all-night meditations. And when I arrived in Thailand, he'd come and visit. He'd do it very well. He could sit all night very straight with a great posture. You never saw him nodding, sleepy. He could do that for many years. He could sit all night if he needed to on these observance days. So he obviously learned something from that. And there's another occasion I remember him telling us, Ajahn Chah had many friends from his younger days, monks that he'd gone wandering in the forests of Thailand with. And on one occasion, one of these monks, his name was Luang Por Chah, came to visit. And all the sangha were gathered there for the evening meeting, and Ajahn Chah and Luang Por Chului would sit down in the middle of the sangha and just started talking about old times. And they had lots of stories and recollections to share, and they're just talking with each other, enjoying each other's company. And Ajahn Sumedho, the young Ajahn Sumedho, like all the other monks, just had to sit there out of respect. You're not allowed to disappear. Out of respect, you sit there with the senior monks as they talk. And they kept on talking. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. So they went on, and for hour after hour through the night they were talking. And Ajahn Sumedho was sitting there again, not happy, thinking, this is a waste of time. I should be off meditating, doing my own practice. Why do I have to listen to the senior monks chit-chatting? And he said every so often Ajahn Chah would look across at him, just glance at him, and Ajahn Sumedho was sitting there with an angry, complaining state of mind. But Ajahn Chah would look at him and then carry on talking to Luang Por Chului. Ajahn Chah didn't say anything, but he just looked at him and seemed to recognize what was going on in Ajahn Sumedho's mind. And then he said about 1 or 2 a.m., he'd been sitting there fuming with a lot of aversion for hour after hour, working with his own anger. Then he just had this breakthrough where he realized, I'm sitting here miserable because of my own angry thoughts. I can't really blame anyone else. This is my own thinking, my own mood, my own experience. And he finally took responsibility for it and just said, I'm not going to think like this anymore. Why suffer unnecessarily? So he said that insight was so clear that mindfulness arose, and he let go of all his anger at that point and experienced this really blissful state of mind of samadhi as the hindrances dropped away. And then he thought to himself, doesn't matter how long Ajahn Chah and Luang Por Chului carry on talking, I'm just going to sit here, I'm now peaceful, I'll just carry on meditating. And he said as soon as he thought like that, Luang Por Chah looked across at him and then told the monks, we've talked enough, now it's time to go. So there were many instances like that Luang Por Sumedho, the young Luang Por Sumedho, had to go through. In the presence of Ajahn Chah or in the monastery, just learning the monk's life, learning the Vinaya, learning the meditation techniques, learning to be mindful with different situations. And later on he would tell us these kind of stories. As I said, he would come to Thailand once a year after he'd established the monastery, Chithurst Monastery in southern England. He would come back and visit Luang Por Chah, his teacher, and that would be a chance for us to do meditation retreats with him, usually in January. And I remember when he'd come back, in those days he'd start his first talk of the meditation retreat, he would usually start saying something like, the past is a memory, the future is unknown, now is the knowing. This is a famous reflection from Luang Por Sumedho beginning meditation retreats. And he would lead by example. He'd sit very well for many hours a day. I remember one time during the 80s, anyone from the UK might remember, anyone older person, there was just once a hurricane came through southern England. It's unusual, UK doesn't usually get hurricanes. And it was something that was not predicted. The weather people got it all wrong. They said it wouldn't happen, but it did. And it caught everyone by surprise. And it was a very damaging hurricane. It took off the chimney of my parents' house, I remember, telling me later. And it knocked over many, many big old trees, caused a lot of damage and chaos in England at that time. And the monastery Chithurst was affected. There was damage and trees were blown over. So as one year Luang Por Sumedho came to Wat Nanachat, and on the first night of his retreat he said, well, we're all here, we're going to have a nice meditation retreat. It's a good time for the sangha to be together and meditate. We're not expecting any disasters, there's not going to be any hurricanes, there's not going to be any storms or anything. And after the first night's talk, we all went back to our huts, and strangely enough, there was a tornado went straight through the monastery that night. A very unusual weather event, is very localized. They said it was only about 1 or 2 kilometers wide. This tornado cut through just that area and brought down lots of large trees, and houses in the local village were demolished by it. So it's a very strong wind, kind of a whirlwind tornado came through the monastery. So the next night, Luang Por Sumedho had to sit down for his talk, and he began his talk. He just started chuckling, and everyone was chuckling because we all knew why, because he'd said, oh, there won't be any hurricanes, and then there was. So it just shows you everything is uncertain, and that has been one of the teachings he's given over the years, that everything is not sure. Just like his teacher, Luang Por Chah, used to teach. You can't predict things, you can't be sure what life will bring you. So Luang Por Sumedho would come to visit Luang Por Chah every year, and he'd teach the sangha. Obviously he would teach around the world, so during that period in the 80s, a few different monasteries were starting under his auspices. There was in New Zealand, and then later around UK, other monasteries, branch monasteries started under his guidance, and then Switzerland and Italy, and then in the 90s more in USA as well. So Ajahn Sumedho came to Thailand, and then on one of those occasions he was giving a retreat. In the later years he wouldn't give his retreats at Wat Nana Chat, he would give them at a monastery called Wat Khön, the monastery in a reservoir. It's like a forested island, a jungle island in the middle of a reservoir created by a dam, a hydroelectric dam. And that was one of Luang Por Chah's favourite monasteries, because it was a really large forest full of animals, big trees, very good environment. And so we would go there for a retreat with Luang Por Sumedho. So the year Luang Por Chah passed away, we were having one of those retreats. I personally spent a lot of time with Luang Por Chah, caring for him, and I'd finished one shift caring for Luang Por Chah, and then I came across to this retreat, and we're all camping in the forest, and it was a bit hard for people to settle down because we knew Luang Por Chah was very ill, very close to the end. But we continued with the retreat anyway. And then one night, there was the news that Luang Por Chah had been taken to the hospital. And we didn't know he was going to pass away that night, but eventually he did. But we didn't know for sure. But in the morning, there was a doubt, what's the state of Ajahn Chah? So one or two of us talked with Ajahn Sumedho, encouraged him, said, we don't know, we should go. I had quite a lot of knowledge about his condition because I'd been attending on him quite close recently. So I encouraged him to go. Ajahn Puriso, who was the abbot at that time, said we should go. So we got in the car, left the retreat, and drove straight to Wat Bapong. I think we went to the hospital first, and he wasn't there. They'd taken him back to the monastery. So we arrived just after Luang Por Chah had passed away, an hour or two after, and went in and paid respects. And obviously for Ajahn Sumedho, it was a very emotional experience. He said later that he shed some tears and obviously experienced a lot of sadness, grief, losing his teacher, somebody who'd been such an inspiring example to him and such a strength, like a rock for the whole sangha, but particularly for Ajahn Sumedho because he was the first. So Ajahn Sumedho had been at Wat Bapong for a few years on his own, and then gradually other foreigners interested in becoming Buddhist monks and interested in Buddhism, such as Jack Cornfield and Douglas Burns, and then later others, they were attracted to come and stay with Ajahn Chah, mainly because Ajahn Sumedho was there. He could interpret Ajahn Chah's teachings. He was an example how to practice the monk's life in the forest. And so that fact that Ajahn Chah was compassionate enough to accept Westerners, foreigners, even though Ajahn Chah didn't speak any English, then Ajahn Sumedho, living there, giving himself up to Ajahn Chah as his teacher and putting up with the difficulties, staying there for a number of years, that was one of the main inspirations for many, many other monks and nuns to come to Thailand and practice. People came and ordained. Some stayed, some didn't stay, but gradually the sangha, the Western sangha, had grown over the years. This is in the 1970s. And at one point Ajahn Sumedho, he said he still wanted to practice meditation and experience some seclusion and test himself in the practice. So after he'd been a monk for about 5 or 6 years, he went on a trip around Thailand, staying with some teachers, and then he was invited to go to India. So he went to India on his own without any real support and survived for about 6 months, travelling there, wandering around India, going to different places. But he said while he was in India at that time, he had this, what he calls a gratitude experience, where he just reflected on his time with Ajahn Chah, and now that he was in a different place, peaceful, different situation, he said he had all this gratitude arise to Ajahn Chah for all the teachings he'd been given, and for the training, and just for the opportunity to practice. And he came back from India thinking, I really should just give myself to Ajahn Chah and the sangha and do whatever I can to help, because I feel I'm so blessed and I've been so well supported by Ajahn Chah and I've received so much from him. So Ajahn Sumedho had come back to Wat Pah Pong, and he said he went to Ajahn Chah and said, I'm so grateful for your teachings. I'll do whatever you want. Wherever you want to send me, I'll go. Whatever you instruct me to do, I'll do. He said he just wanted to give himself completely to Ajahn Chah. And he even offered to go to one of the most unpopular little branch monasteries, which was in an area that was very poor, hot, a monastery that none of the monks wanted to go to. Ajahn Sumedho said, I'll even go there. Just send me there, I'll do it. But Ajahn Chah didn't send him there. Ajahn Chah sent him to a bamboo forest, a forest with a lot of bamboo, near about 8 kilometers away from Wat Pah Pong, at a village called Bungwai. And that's where Wat Pananachat, or the International Forest Monastery, started in about 1976. The monks, Buddhist monks, we have bowls to eat in, and one of the practices we do with our bowls is we fire our bowl. In the old days they were iron bowls, and if you didn't fire them then they got rusty easily. Nowadays we have stainless steel bowls, which are very easy to look after, but we still fire them to darken the steel colour. So the monks were always looking for places to go and collect firewood, bamboo, to bake their bowls or fire their bowls. And this was a forest that had been recommended. It's about 8 kilometres away from Wat Pah Pong, but Luang Liam, a good friend of Luang Sumedho, and other monks used to walk over there to collect alms food in the morning. So they'd walk 8 kilometres to the Bungwai village on an empty stomach, collect food, and then walk 8 kilometres back to Wat Pah Pong for the meal. So it was known that this village had bamboo, that the villagers were supportive. So it was agreed Ajahn Sumedho and some of the Western monks went over to stay in that forest, just camping, to fire their bowls. But very quickly the villagers built some simple bamboo huts for them and invited them to stay on. And Ajahn Chah seemed to encourage that. So that was the beginnings of the first foreign branch monastery of Ajahn Chah, is Wat Pah Nanach Chat, around 1976, with Ajahn Sumedho as the senior monk. And many of the senior monks around the world started there, like myself, in later years. But not long after starting Wat Pah Nanach Chat, Ajahn Sumedho, I think his mother was sick in the US, so he wanted to visit her. And there'd also been invitations from the London Buddhist Society or the English Sangha Trust looking for monks, and Ajahn Mahabua had visited London the year before. So it was agreed Ajahn Sumedho would leave Wat Pah Nanach Chat, leave it in the hands of the other Western Sangha members, and he travelled across to the US. I think it was called Siam Air in those days. Thai Airways didn't exist yet. And he travelled to see his parents on the west coast, and then he travelled back to Thailand but via the UK and met George Sharp and some of the others from the English Sangha Trust, and that's probably the origins of what would later become Chithurst Monastery, Amaravati and the English Sangha. So Ajahn Sumedho, having visited England, came back to Thailand. Wat Pah Nanach Chat was now established. There were other monks living there, so it was agreed that Ajahn Sumedho would return to England and take Luang Por Chah with him. So that was another sort of very important time for our Sangha and the history of Buddhist monasticism in the West. First of all, the fact that Luang Por Sumedho was willing to live with Ajahn Chah, Luang Por Chah was willing to take on foreigners, and then Ajahn Chah going with Ajahn Sumedho to the UK to visit, to teach and visit. That was another very seminal moment in the history of Buddhist monasticism, you might say, in Europe in particular. So Ajahn Chah went once, I think in 1977, if I remember, and then stayed at the Hampstead Vihara because Chithurst Monastery hadn't started, and then returned a couple of years later again to see the new property which became Chithurst Buddhist Monastery, see the Sangha, and if you watch the film The Buddha Comes to Sussex, you can see some of those events. And one thing I remember Ajahn Sumedho saying is that before Luang Por Chah came to visit the second time, he was a bit concerned because things were going it was quite difficult in those days. The support was very limited. The Sangha were very new. It's quite hard to establish the feeling of a harmonious Sangha living together like in a Thai monastery because everything was so new and in a non-Buddhist culture. So when they were preparing for Luang Por Chah's second visit, Ajahn Sumedho said he had this concern, what will I tell Luang Por Chah? Things are not going that well, it's not that easy to live here. It wasn't that they were thinking of quitting or leaving, it was just it wasn't easy. But he didn't want to say anything negative to Luang Por Chah. So when Luang Por Chah arrived and asked him, he said, Sumedho, how are things going? Ajahn Sumedho said, everything is fine. But Luang Por Chah, being very sharp and wise, said, well, if everything's fine, there'll be no wisdom here. Because one of Ajahn Chah's kind of emphasis in his practice and his teachings was that when there's suffering, you learn. If there are problems, you learn from them. You learn from your own dukkha, your own suffering, your own internal negativity, doubts, worries, concerns, anger. So if everything is fine, you won't be learning anything. So that was the way he taught Ajahn Sumedho. So still able to bring his flavour of teaching over to the UK. And Ajahn Sumedho remembered, Ajahn Chah coming to the UK, he was concerned also for Ajahn Chah, just how would the great Buddhist master deal with a non-Buddhist culture where people don't show you respect, they don't know anything about the Vinaya and the training and the meditation of the monks. But he said he was pleasantly surprised that Ajahn Chah maintained his cool equanimity and didn't seem to have any problems at all. And there's a number of incidents when they were confronted with people who had opinions and views or just didn't understand what monks were, but Ajahn Chah seemed to manage very well. Perhaps the famous one is they're walking out on Bindabata, I think, one day. They didn't get any food, but they would walk Bindabata with their bowls in the streets of London, and a group of young teenagers, mucking about, looking aggressive, came up to them, challenging them. I seem to remember at that time one of the hit TV shows in the UK was one called Kung Fu, with David Carradine. You might remember it. Anyone older might remember it. And so people loved to imitate the star of this show doing their Kung Fu. And when they saw these Buddhist monks, they came up imitating the show, sort of wanting to do some Kung Fu with the monks. It still happens today. For some reason, people think we do Kung Fu. We don't do Kung Fu. Anyway, they did a few movements in front of Ajahn Chah. Ajahn Sumedho was behind him, worried, what shall I do about these guys? But before he had to do anything, they just disappeared. Not sure whether somebody came and they got afraid or whatever, but anyway, suddenly they just ran away and gone. And then Ajahn Chah just turned to Ajahn Sumedho later and said, you get a lot of good lessons in the UK, don't you? So he wasn't bothered by the incident. And there were many similar occasions like that where Ajahn Sumedho, the concerned student of Ajahn Chah, found that he didn't really need to worry because Ajahn Chah coped very well. So I've been going a bit back and forward here from Ajahn Chah's death back to setting up the monasteries in the UK. And there's a lot to say. Over the years, as I said, the sangha has grown. The monasteries in the UK and around the world have grown. From these early seeds, Ajahn Sumedho being with Ajahn Chah, then starting Wat Nana Chat, then travelling to the UK, starting Chithurst and then Amaravati, and then other monasteries. And later on, Ajahn Sumedho became well known as a teacher in his own right from all this hard work he'd done, teaching the sangha, setting up monasteries, teaching around the world. So around the time of Ajahn Chah's funeral, he was given a title from King Rama IX of Thailand. So he was the first Western monk to receive one of these honorary titles for his contribution to teaching Buddhism, spreading it around the world. And later, having established Amaravati Buddhist Monastery after Ajahn Chah had passed away, they began building their first Ubosita hall, the main hall at Amaravati. And when that was finished, it was like kind of crowning or completing that period of establishing the monasteries in the UK. So I think that was a very happy period for Lumpur Sumedho, although being a senior monk brings many burdens and responsibilities. If you have monks and nuns living with you, it can be quite testing if it's a large community. But nevertheless, that project was completed. And any of you who go and visit Amaravati Buddhist Monastery, there's a beautiful hall there, very suitable for meditation, very good atmosphere. I was lucky enough to take my mother and my sister to that event, the opening of that temple building. And for me personally, it's been quite fortunate that Amaravati Buddhist Monastery started, because my family have got to know Ajahn Sumedho over the years. My mother finds him very inspiring, like so many other people do, and my sister. And they've been able to attend Amaravati Buddhist Monastery over the years. And now they're always asking, when's he coming back? Because the last few years he's been living in Thailand, and he was scheduled to go back to the UK this year, but because of coronavirus, that trip was cancelled. So many of his students and supporters in the UK patiently waiting for him to return. Maybe next year that will happen, we'll have to see. Meanwhile, the last few years, maybe 10 years, he's been living at Wat Pa Ratanawan, run by Ajahn Dhamma, Australian monk who's been here many times. Luang Sumedho has been living there, having hopefully a comfortable time, but still travelling around the world. And before the coronavirus, we did see him here, and many of the other monasteries around the world are always very happy to receive him for his teachings. And he's still teaching today. On Monday he'll be 86, but if you look on YouTube and the websites, there are still teachings coming out. He gave a teaching a few days ago, it was recorded. So 86 years old, still going strong. The wisdom, the clarity is still there. And it's a reflection, isn't it? As monks get older, they're still monks. You don't retire from being a monk. Ajahn Sumedho, Luang Sumedho was retired from being the abbot and teacher at Amaravati Monastery, where he was for 30 years. Ajahn Amaro is now the abbot. But Luang Sumedho is still teaching. He's teaching in Thailand, he's teaching around the world, he's teaching online. So 86 years old, still of great benefit to both sangha and laity. So we're all very grateful for his presence and his teachings and words of wisdom. So tonight I've just been giving you a few recollections of his life, teachings, partly from my own personal point of view, partly from what we know in the sangha. And we hope that he lives for many more years and can continue to be an inspiration to the sangha and laity, to the Buddhist community. We wish him good health. We hope that he stays strong. In Thailand they compare older teachers, so in the last years of their life you might say, but they compare them to like a big old Bodhi tree. A tree, the kind of tree the Buddha was enlightened under. The tree keeps standing there, providing the shade for anyone who comes under it. And a teacher like Luang Sumedho is like that. He keeps providing the shade, the Dhamma, Vinaya that he stands for, that he maintains and teaches through example and through his teachings. He maintains that, and that's like this umbrella or this big shady tree that we can all seek shelter under. Not that we should be lazy, we should take his teachings, put them into practice for ourselves, but it's nice to have these big old trees around and we can make use of them, benefit from them. So we hope that he's there for many more years to come. And so tonight maybe I'll leave you with just these words for your contemplation, and see you next time.